I never thought my own blood could betray me so deeply. Finding that bill felt like a punch straight to my chest. A surgery I never had. Charged to my name. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade ever could. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I'm still sitting here in my tiny Chicago apartment, wrapped in the same faded blue sweater I've worn for 3 winters now. The smell of old coffee mingles with the musty scent of worn upholstery. And outside my window, the L train rumbles past like a metallic heartbeat that never stops. My days have blurred into each other for months now, checking the mail with trembling fingers, refilling my 7-day pill box every Sunday morning, shuffling between my cramped kitchen and the living room where family photos stare back at me like silent judges. Most days I feel invisible to them, completely invisible. I spend hours just waiting for a phone call that doesn't come, for a visit that never happens, for someone to remember that I exist. The loneliness sits on my chest like a heavy stone, making it hard to breathe sometimes. Last Tuesday morning changed everything. A crumpled envelope had slipped through my mail slot, landing on the worn carpet with a soft thud that somehow sounded ominous. I bent down slowly, my back isn't what it used to be, and picked it up with hands that have grown more fragile with each passing year. The return address made my stomach drop. Chicago General Hospital, billing department. I tore it open with shaking fingers, and there it was. A bill for $17,000 for a gallbladder surgery I never had, performed on a date when I was right here, in this apartment, watching my afternoon stories and eating leftover soup. I stared at that piece of paper for so long that my vision blurred. My mind raced back to last Sunday's family dinner at my son David's house on the north side. I remembered how my daughter-in-law Melissa had smiled at me, that strange, too sweet smile that never quite reached her eyes, how she'd avoided my questions about my health, changing the subject every time I mentioned feeling tired or having trouble sleeping. I swallowed my suspicions then, the way I always do. I thought about the happy times we'd shared, the birthday parties where she'd hug me tight and call me mom. But deep down, sitting there with that fraudulent bill in my lap, a cold knot tightened in my stomach, the kind of knot you get when you finally see the truth you've been avoiding. The afternoon light streaming through my thin curtains seemed dimmer somehow. The sounds of the city, car horns, sirens, the constant hum of life moving forward without me, felt more distant. I was alone with this terrible discovery, and for the first time in years, I didn't know who I could trust. You know that feeling when your whole world shifts on its axis? When something you thought was solid ground suddenly crumbles beneath your feet? That's what happened to me in that moment. 73 years old, and I was learning that the people I'd sacrificed everything for might be the very ones destroying me. Let me tell you about those sacrifices, because they stretch back further than I care to remember. When my husband Paul died 8 years ago, I could have stayed in our little house in Oak Park, could have kept the garden he loved, the workshop where he built birdhouses, the front porch where we watched storms roll in from the lake. But David was struggling. His marriage to Melissa was hitting rough patches, money was tight, and my grandchildren needed stability. So I sold everything. Our house, Paul's tools, most of our furniture. I moved into this cramped one-bedroom apartment near Wicker Park to be close to them, to help however I could. The place smells like the previous tenant's cigarettes, and the neighbors upstairs stomp around at all hours, but I told myself it was temporary, just until the family got back on their feet. That was 8 years ago. 8 years of pouring my monthly Social Security checks into their problems. 8 years of cooking their favorite meals, watching my grandchildren when they needed a babysitter, lending money that was never repaid. 8 years of being the safety net that never got to rest. I remember the phone call that started it all. David's voice was thick with desperation when he said, "Mom, we can't afford the mortgage this month. The bank is threatening foreclosure." I could hear Melissa crying in the background, my grandchildren asking what was wrong. What was I supposed to do? Let my family lose their home? So I sent the money, $2,000 from the small savings account Paul and I had built over 40 years of marriage. It was supposed to be a loan, but the word repayment never came up again. When they needed help with car repairs 3 months later, I sent another $1,500. When little Emma needed braces, I covered the down payment. When Tommy wanted to join the travel baseball team, I paid the fees. Every time I told myself this was what families do. This was love in action. But the thank you calls got shorter, the visits less frequent. Family dinners became obligations they seemed to endure rather than enjoy. I started noticing how Melissa would check her phone constantly when I spoke, how David would find excuses to step outside for important calls that couldn't wait. The breaking point should have come last Christmas. I'd spent 3 days cooking all their favorite dishes. My mother's pierogi recipe, the honey-glazed ham Paul used to make, homemade apple pie with cinnamon ice cream. I set the table with my good china, the set my grandmother brought from Poland, and waited. The dinner was supposed to start at 2 o'clock. They showed up at 5:30. No apology, no explanation. Melissa complained that the food was cold, that she was trying to cut carbs and couldn't eat most of what I'd made. David barely looked up from his phone during the entire meal. My grandchildren, now 14 and 16, seemed more interested in their devices than in talking to their grandmother. I sat at the head of that table, watching my family pick at the food I'd lovingly prepared, and felt more alone than I ever had in my life. The silence was broken only by the clinking of forks and the occasional ding of a text message. When they left that night, taking containers of leftovers without a word of thanks, I stood in my kitchen surrounded by dirty dishes and wondered when I'd become such a burden to the people I loved most. But I made excuses for them. They're busy, I told myself. Young people today have so many pressures. I'm just being too sensitive, too needy. I pushed down the hurt and kept giving, kept hoping, kept believing that love would eventually be returned. The wake-up calls came in smaller moments too, like the time I was sick with the flu for a week, running a fever of 102, and no one checked on me. Mrs. Ramirez from across the hall, a woman I barely knew then, brought me soup and made sure I had medicine. My own son didn't even know I was ill until I mentioned it 2 weeks later, or the time I fell in my bathroom and couldn't get up for 20 minutes. I lay there on the cold tile floor, my hips screaming in pain, wondering if this was how it would end, alone and helpless in a tiny apartment on the wrong side of town. When I finally managed to call David, he said he'd come check on me later. Later turned into 3 days. The signs were all there, but I kept painting over them with hope and denial. I kept believing that family meant something, that the years of sacrifice would matter, that love would win in the end. I was a fool. A tired, lonely, generous fool. The truth about the surgery bill was like a crack in a dam. Once it appeared, everything else started flooding through. All the times Melissa had asked about my insurance cards, claiming she needed them for emergencies. The times she'd offered to help me organize my paperwork, then gone through my files with suspicious thoroughness. The way she'd insisted on adding her name to my emergency contact forms at the doctor's office. I'd thought she was being helpful, caring, looking out for her aging mother-in-law who sometimes forgot things or got confused by medical jargon. But sitting there with that fraudulent bill in my hands, I realized she'd been building a case, learning my personal information, gaining access to my identity, positioning herself to use my insurance for procedures I knew nothing about. The betrayal was complete and devastating. This wasn't just about money, though $17,000 represented nearly a year of my Social Security payments. This was about trust shattered, love manipulated, family bonds twisted into something ugly and predatory. This was about discovering that the person I'd welcomed into my heart, who called me mom and hugged me at holidays, had been slowly stealing pieces of my life. I called the hospital that afternoon, my hands shaking so hard I could barely dial the number. The billing department was polite but firm. Yes, the surgery had been performed. Yes, my insurance had been charged. No, they couldn't discuss details due to privacy laws, but they could confirm that someone using my name and insurance information had received the procedure 6 months earlier. 6 months ago. I tried to remember where I was, what I was doing. It was March, still cold and gray in Chicago. I remembered spending most of that month in this apartment, dealing with a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Melissa had insisted I stay home, avoid crowded places like hospitals or clinics where I might catch something worse. "You need to rest, Mom," she'd said, her voice full of fake concern. "Let us handle everything else." While I was home resting, someone was at Chicago General using my identity to get free medical care. The irony was sharp and bitter. While I suffered alone with my cough, afraid to burden anyone by asking for help getting to a doctor, someone else was receiving $17,000 worth of surgery on my insurance. The tears came then, silent and hot, streaming down my cheeks as I sat in my threadbare armchair. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. This wasn't a stranger who'd stolen my identity through some random crime. This was family. This was someone who sat at my dinner table, who knew my favorite flowers and my late husband's stories. Someone who'd held my hand during Paul's funeral and promised we'd get through the grief together. I dropped the bill and heard something shatter. My teacup, the delicate china one with tiny roses that Paul had given me for our 20th anniversary, lay in pieces on the hardwood floor. The sound echoed in my small apartment like a gunshot, sharp and final. I stared at the broken fragments and saw my family reflected in them, beautiful ones, but irreparably damaged. For the first time in years, I thought about walking away, about cutting ties, changing my phone number, moving somewhere they couldn't find me. The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. What would it feel like to wake up without dreading the phone calls asking for money? What would it be like to eat dinner without wondering if I was being too needy by calling to share my day? What would freedom look like at 73 years old? But fear clawed at me from all directions. What if speaking up meant losing what little connection I still had with my grandchildren? What if David chose Melissa's side, as he had so many times before? What if I ended up completely alone, with no family at all? The thought of facing my remaining years in total isolation seemed worse than accepting the manipulation and lies. I cleaned up the broken teacup with trembling hands, each shard a memory of happier times. I packed away the family photos that had been watching me from the mantel, their smiling faces now feeling like mockeries. For the first time in decades, I looked in my bathroom mirror and really saw myself, not as a mother or grandmother, but as a woman, a tired, exploited, forgotten woman who deserved better. That night, I made a decision that changed everything. I decided to fight back. The next morning, I called David. My voice was barely above a whisper when I said, "We need to talk." I found something. The silence on the other end stretched like a chasm between us. Finally, he sighed and agreed to come over that evening. When he arrived, I could see the guilt written all over his face before I even showed him the bill. He knew. Maybe not the details, but he knew something was wrong. His eyes darted around my apartment like he was looking for escape routes, and his hands fidgeted with his car keys. "Mom, what's this about?" he asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. I handed him the bill without a word, watched as his face went pale, watched as his mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of unspoken truths. "Do you know about this?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. His face twisted, denial mixing with confusion and something that might have been panic. "Mom, you're making a mistake. This has to be some kind of error. Maybe you forgot about having the surgery. You know how your memory has been lately." The gaslighting hit me like a slap. Here was my own son, suggesting that I was losing my mind rather than admitting what we both knew was true. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest, replacing the warmth I'd always felt when looking at his face. "I've never had gallbladder surgery, David. I've never even had gallbladder problems. This happened while I was home with that cough, remember? When Melissa insisted I stay away from hospitals?" He looked away, staring out my window at the L tracks. "Maybe someone stole your identity. It happens to older people all the time." The way he said older people stung, like I was some doddering fool who couldn't keep track of her own life. Like my age made me automatically suspect, unreliable, confused. I saw how easy it would be for him to dismiss everything I said, to paint me as a paranoid old woman imagining conspiracies. That's when Melissa walked in without knocking, using the spare key I'd given her for emergencies. She looked perfectly put together, her blonde hair styled and her makeup flawless, like she was heading to a business meeting instead of confronting her mother-in-law about insurance fraud. "What's all this drama about?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. She saw the bill in David's hands and her expression barely flickered, but I caught the flash of calculation in her eyes. "Someone used my insurance to get surgery," I said, watching her face carefully. $17,000 worth of surgery I never had. Melissa's laugh was light and dismissive. "Oh, honey, you're imagining things. You're just confused. This kind of thing happens when people get older. They forget things, mix up dates, create stories to fill in the gaps." There it was again. That patronizing tone, that assumption that my age made me unreliable, that my concerns could be brushed away as the ramblings of a senile old woman. I felt rage building in my chest, hot and pure and more powerful than anything I'd felt in years. "I'm not confused," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I know exactly where I was 6 months ago. I was here, in this apartment, sick and alone, while my family ignored me. And someone was using my identity to get free medical care." Melissa's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating underneath. "You don't understand the sacrifices we've all made," she said, her voice taking on a wounded quality. "The stress we've been under trying to take care of you, trying to make sure you're okay. Maybe you did have the surgery and just don't remember. Maybe the doctors thought it was necessary and you agreed to it." The manipulation was breathtaking. She was trying to make me doubt my own reality, my own memories, my own sanity. She was painting herself as the victim, the selfless daughter-in-law burdened with caring for a difficult, forgetful old woman. And worst of all, I could see David starting to buy it. My grandchildren had been watching from the hallway, Emma and Tommy now teenagers who seemed uncomfortable with the tension crackling through my small apartment. They looked at me with expressions I couldn't read, pity, maybe, or embarrassment. Did they see me as the crazy grandmother causing problems for their parents? Had they already been told stories about my failing memory, my increasing demands, my inability to manage my own affairs? The realization that I might have already lost them, that they might already see me through the lens of their mother's lies, was almost unbearable. These children I'd loved and spoiled and worried about, who I'd rearranged my entire life to be close to, might already be lost to me. "I need you both to leave," I said quietly. The words surprised me as much as they surprised them. David looked shocked. Melissa's eyebrows rose, and even I couldn't believe I'd found the strength to ask my own family to go. "Mom, let's not be hasty," David started. But I held up my hand. "Please leave. I need time to think, and I need to make some phone calls." After they left, the apartment felt different. Not just quiet. It had always been quiet, but peaceful in a way it hadn't been in years. The absence of their judgment, their manipulation, their subtle cruelty was like taking off shoes that had been too tight for too long. Mrs. Rosa Ramirez knocked on my door 20 minutes later. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and the kindest eyes I'd ever seen, and she lived in the apartment directly across from mine. We'd nodded to each other in the hallway, exchanged pleasantries by the mailboxes, but I'd never really gotten to know her. "I heard raised voices," she said gently. "Are you okay, dear?" Something about her genuine concern, the way she called me dear, without any patronizing undertone, broke open the dam I'd been building around my emotions. I started crying, deep sobs that came from somewhere I'd kept locked for years. Rosa didn't ask questions. She just came in, made us both tea, and sat with me while I fell apart. When I finally told her about the bill, about the betrayal, about the years of feeling used and discarded, she listened without judgment. "I had a daughter-in-law like that," she said quietly. "Sweet as honey to your face, poison behind your back. It took me too long to see it, and by the time I did, she'd turned my son against me completely." Her words were a comfort I hadn't expected. Here was someone who understood, who'd lived through something similar, who could assure me that I wasn't crazy or paranoid or imagining things. Here was validation that what I was experiencing was real and wrong and worthy of anger. "What did you do?" I asked. "I stopped trying to buy their love," she said simply. "I stopped giving money, stopped making excuses, stopped accepting crumbs and pretending they were a feast. It was the hardest thing I ever did, but it saved my life." That night, for the first time in months, I made a decision that was entirely about me. When Melissa texted asking for money to cover Emma's school trip, $800 they needed right away, I stared at the message for a long time. I thought about all the other times I'd said yes without question. All the times I'd depleted my modest savings to solve their problems while my own needs went unmet. I typed back, "No, just that." No explanations, no apologies, no offers to help in some other way. No. I turned off my phone and went to bed, and for the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking up in panic about money or family, or whether I was doing enough to earn their love. The next morning felt different. The winter sunlight streaming through my windows seemed brighter, the sounds of the city less harsh. I made coffee and actually tasted it, instead of just drinking it out of habit. I looked at the empty spaces on my mantle where the family photos had been, and felt relief instead of sadness. I walked to Lincoln Park that afternoon, something I hadn't done in years. The lake was gray and choppy, whitecaps dancing under a pewter sky, and the cold air bit at my cheeks. But I felt alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I wasn't rushing to meet anyone's needs, wasn't worried about phone calls or demands or guilt trips. I was just a woman walking by the lake, and that was enough. When I got home, Mrs. Ramirez was waiting in the hallway with a plate of homemade tamales and an invitation to watch old movies together. We spent the evening laughing at Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, and I realized I hadn't laughed, really laughed, in longer than I could remember. That weekend, I did something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I called the legal aid clinic downtown and made an appointment. My voice shook as I explained about the fraudulent bill, about the insurance identity theft, about needing help understanding my options. The lawyer, a kind woman named Sarah Chen, listened to my story with growing outrage. "This is identity theft," she said firmly. "And if it was done by family members, it's elder abuse. Both are serious crimes." Hearing someone else say it out loud, that this was abuse, that I was a victim, that what had been done to me was wrong, was more validating than I could have imagined. For so long, I'd wondered if I was overreacting, being too sensitive, misunderstanding the situation, but this professional, this expert in the law, was telling me that my instincts were right. "What are my options?" I asked. "We can report this to the police." We can work with the hospital to investigate how your insurance information was accessed. We can help you protect your identity going forward. But, she paused, looking at me carefully, you need to understand that if family members are involved, pursuing this could mean criminal charges. The weight of that possibility sat heavy on my shoulders as I walked home. Did I have the strength to see this through? Did I want to be responsible for potentially sending my daughter-in-law to jail, for tearing my family apart completely? But then I thought about the $17,000, about all the money I'd given over the years, about all the times I'd been made to feel like I was the problem. I called David that night. I've spoken to a lawyer, I said without preamble, about the insurance fraud. The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. Mom, let's not escalate this. Let's handle it as a family. The way we've handled everything else? I asked. By pretending it didn't happen? By making me feel like I'm losing my mind? We're worried about you, he said, and I could hear Melissa coaching him in the background. You've been different lately. Paranoid. Maybe you should see someone. Get some help. There it was again. The suggestion that I was mentally incompetent, that my legitimate concerns were symptoms of decline rather than responses to real betrayal. The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I wondered how many times they'd used this tactic before. I'm not paranoid, I said firmly. I'm not confused. I'm not losing my mind. Someone committed identity theft using my information, and I'm going to find out who. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking, but my resolve stronger than it had been in years. The investigation moved quickly once the authorities got involved. Hospital security footage showed Melissa checking in for the gallbladder surgery using my name and insurance card. Phone records proved she'd called to schedule the procedure, pretending to be me. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. When the police called to tell me they were ready to make an arrest, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. This was my family. These were people I'd loved and trusted and sacrificed for. But they were also people who'd betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. Melissa was arrested on a Tuesday morning, led away from her house in handcuffs while neighbors watched from their windows. The local news picked up the story. North Side woman charged with elder abuse, insurance fraud. And suddenly my private pain became public knowledge. David called that afternoon, his voice thick with anger and desperation. Are you happy now? He demanded. You've destroyed our family. The kids are devastated. Melissa might go to prison. How could you do this to us? The blame shifting was breathtaking. Somehow, I was the villain in this story. I was the one who'd destroyed the family by refusing to be quietly victimized. I was the problem, not the person who'd committed felony fraud. I didn't do anything to you, I said quietly. I didn't steal anyone's identity. I didn't commit fraud. I didn't lie or manipulate or gaslight anyone. I just refused to pretend it didn't happen. She's the mother of your grandchildren, he said, playing what he thought was his trump card. And I'm your mother, I replied. But that didn't stop either of you from treating me like an ATM with no feelings. The family meeting that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. David, his parents, Melissa's sister, even my grandchildren were there, all gathered in David's living room like some twisted intervention. But instead of trying to help someone with a problem, they were trying to convince me to drop the charges and keep this in the family. I sat in the chair that had always been mine during family gatherings, but everything felt different now. The dynamics had shifted completely. I wasn't the grateful grandmother anymore. Wasn't the soft touch who could be counted on to fix everyone's problems. I was the enemy, the one who'd betrayed the family by refusing to be betrayed quietly. One by one, they tried different approaches. David's father offered to pay restitution if I'd go to the police and explain that it had all been a misunderstanding. Melissa's sister painted a picture of her as a victim of postpartum depression who'd made a terrible mistake. David himself promised that they'd pay back every penny I'd ever given them if I'd just make this go away. But it was Emma, my 16-year-old granddaughter, who delivered the killing blow. She looked at me with teenage disdain and said, "Why are you doing this to us, Grandma? Mom made a mistake, but you're ruining our whole family. Don't you love us anymore?" The manipulation was perfect because it came from someone I loved unconditionally. The implication that love meant accepting abuse, that family loyalty required me to absorb criminal behavior without complaint, was delivered by a child who'd learned these lessons from her parents. I looked around that room at faces I'd loved for years, and realized that love had become a weapon they used against me. Every holiday dinner I'd cooked, every bill I'd paid, every sacrifice I'd made was now being used to guilt me into accepting one more betrayal, one more theft, one more piece of my dignity stripped away. I stood up slowly, my arthritis making my movements careful and deliberate. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope containing photos, pictures of all of us together over the years, smiling and laughing and looking like the perfect happy family we'd never actually been. "I need you all to understand something," I said, my voice steadier than it had ever been. "I loved you enough to give you everything I had. My money, my time, my home, my peace of mind. I loved you enough to move into a tiny apartment so I could be close to you. I loved you enough to ignore every red flag, every warning sign, every moment when I felt used and discarded." I tore the first photo in half, the sound sharp in the silent room. It was a Christmas picture from 5 years ago. All of us around the tree with forced smiles and expensive presents I'd bought with my Social Security money. "But love has to go both ways," I continued, tearing another photo. "Respect has to be mutual. And what you did to me, stealing my identity, using my insurance, lying to my face, making me question my own sanity, that wasn't love. That was abuse." The room was silent except for the sound of photographs tearing. Years of memories reduced to scattered pieces, years of one-sided relationships finally acknowledged for what they were. "I will no longer buy your love with my money," I said, facing each of them in turn. "I will no longer accept crumbs and pretend they're a feast. I will no longer make myself smaller so you can feel bigger. Respect me or lose me. Those are your options." David started to protest, but I held up my hand. "I'm done talking. I'm done explaining. I'm done begging for basic human decency from people who should have given it freely. The charges stand, the investigation continues, and from now on, if you want me in your life, you'll have to earn it the same way I've been trying to earn your love for years." I walked out of that house for the last time, leaving behind the scattered remains of photographs and relationships that had never been as real as I'd hoped. The December air was brutal against my face, but I'd never felt more free. The weeks that followed tested my resolve in ways I hadn't expected. Melissa's arrest became public knowledge in our neighborhood, and I found myself the subject of gossip and speculation. Some people saw me as a victim who'd finally fought back. Others painted me as a vindictive old woman who'd destroyed her own family over money. The pressure to reconcile, to forgive, to keep the family together came from unexpected sources. My pastor suggested that Christian forgiveness required me to drop the charges. Mutual friends implied that I was being unnecessarily harsh, that families should stick together no matter what. Even some of the neighbors whispered that I was wrong to involve the police in family business. But Mrs. Ramirez understood. She'd lived through similar battles with her own family, and she knew the courage it took to choose self-respect over family approval. She became my anchor during those difficult weeks, reminding me that I wasn't responsible for other people's choices, only for my own response to them. The truth about the extent of Melissa's fraud came out during the investigation. The gallbladder surgery was just the beginning. She'd also used my insurance for physical therapy sessions, psychiatric consultations, and prescription medications. The total theft was close to $30,000 spread over 2 years. More devastating than the financial loss was the realization of how calculated it had all been. She'd researched my insurance coverage, learned my personal information, even called my doctor's office pretending to be me to get details about my medical history. This wasn't a desperate mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a systematic, long-term plan to defraud me. The detective handling the case, a patient woman named Detective Martinez, explained that this kind of elder abuse was more common than I'd realized. "Family members have the access and trust that makes this kind of fraud easy," she said. "And victims often don't report it because they don't want to destroy family relationships." "But the relationships were already destroyed," I said. I just finally admitted it. 3 months after Melissa's arrest, the case went to court. David hired an expensive lawyer who tried to paint me as a confused old woman who'd given permission for the medical procedures and then forgotten about them. They brought in character witnesses who testified about Melissa's devotion to her family, her struggles with depression, her role as a loving mother. But the evidence was clear. Security footage, phone records, forged signatures, everything pointed to deliberate fraud. When it was my turn to speak, I stood in that courtroom and told my story simply and honestly. I talked about the years of financial support, the gradual isolation, the gaslighting that had made me question my own reality. "I'm not asking for revenge," I said to the judge. "I'm asking for accountability. What happened to me wasn't a family dispute or a misunderstanding. It was a crime. And if we don't call it what it is, it will happen to other elderly people who trust their families to protect them, not prey on them." Melissa was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. It was a victory, but it felt hollow. Justice had been served, but my family was still gone. My grandchildren still saw me as the villain who'd sent their mother to jail. David still blamed me for everything that had happened. The day after the sentencing, I got a text from Emma. I hope you're happy now. You destroyed our family, and for what? Money? Was it worth it? I stared at that message for a long time, feeling the old familiar pain of being misunderstood and blamed. But then I thought about the woman I'd been 3 months ago, frightened, confused, willing to accept any treatment rather than risk being alone. And I thought about the woman I was becoming, someone who valued herself enough to demand respect. I typed back. It was never about money. It was about truth. I love you, and that will never change. But I won't apologize for refusing to be a victim. She didn't respond, and I didn't expect her to. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some relationships, once poisoned, can't be healed. I was learning to live with that reality, to find peace in my own integrity, even if it meant loneliness. But I wasn't as alone as I'd feared. Mrs. Ramirez had introduced me to her circle of friends, other women who'd lived full lives, who'd survived their own betrayals and losses, who understood that resilience looks different at 70 than it does at 40. We met for coffee every Tuesday, played cards on Friday nights, and took turns cooking for each other when someone was feeling unwell. And then, unexpectedly, I found something I'd never had before, a passion that belonged entirely to me. It started with a flyer in my mailbox about art classes for seniors at the Chicago Cultural Center. I'd always loved looking at paintings in museums, but I'd never tried creating any myself. Art seemed like something for talented people, creative people, people with natural gifts I'd never possessed. But I had time now, time that wasn't being consumed by other people's crises, time that wasn't spent waiting for phone calls or planning visits that might not happen. So on a cold February morning, I bundled up in my warmest coat and took the bus downtown to my first art class. The instructor, Marcus, was a young black man with paint-stained fingers and an infectious enthusiasm for color and light. He looked at our class of nervous seniors and said, "Art isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. It's about putting something of yourself onto canvas and not being afraid of what comes out." My first painting was terrible, a muddy landscape that looked nothing like the park scene I'd attempted to capture. But something about the process fascinated me, the way colors blended and separated, the way brushstrokes could convey emotion even when technique failed, the way the canvas accepted whatever I offered without judgment. I started going to class twice a week, then 3 times. I bought my own supplies and set up a tiny easel by my living room window. I painted the view from my apartment, the L tracks cutting across gray winter skies, the old brick buildings with their fire escapes and satellite dishes, the glimpses of Lake Michigan between downtown towers. My paintings improved slowly, but more importantly, I found peace in the process. When I was mixing colors or struggling with perspective, I wasn't thinking about family betrayal or loneliness or the uncertainty of my future. I was completely present, completely absorbed in the work of creation. Marcus noticed my progress and encouraged me to try more challenging subjects. "Paint what you feel," he suggested. "Don't worry about making it pretty or realistic. Just be honest." So I painted my emotions. I painted the gray fog of depression that had surrounded me for years, using heavy brush strokes and muddy colors that seemed to swallow light. I painted the red rage of betrayal, sharp angular shapes that collided and destroyed each other on the canvas. I painted the blue loneliness of empty apartments and silent phones, vast spaces filled with nothing but yearning. And then gradually, I started painting hope. Yellow sunrises breaking through storm clouds, green growth pushing through concrete, the warm orange glow of friendship and acceptance I'd found with Mrs. Ramirez and our Tuesday coffee group. 6 months after starting art classes, I had my first small exhibition at the community center. Just 8 paintings hung on portable walls in a room that smelled like coffee and copy paper, but they were mine. They represented my journey from victim to survivor, from silence to voice, from invisibility to presence. Mrs. Ramirez brought our whole coffee group to the opening, and they stood in front of my paintings asking questions and offering praise that felt genuine and earned. For the first time in my adult life, I was being celebrated for something I'd accomplished, not for something I'd given away. That's when I saw him, David, standing near the back of the room, looking uncomfortable but determined. He'd come alone, without Melissa, who was still serving her sentence. When our eyes met, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: respect. He approached slowly, stopping in front of my painting titled Breaking Point, the one with the shattered teacup at its center, surrounded by the debris of broken trust and abandoned hope. "This is what happened to us, isn't it?" he said quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I'm sorry," he continued, and for the first time in our relationship, the apology felt real. "I knew something was wrong, but it was easier to believe you were confused than to admit my wife was stealing from you. I failed you as a son, and I'm sorry." The apology didn't erase years of betrayal and neglect, but it was a beginning. We talked for an hour that night, really talked, about the family we'd been and the people we'd become. He told me about the financial pressure he'd been under, about Melissa's control over their household, about his own cowardice in choosing the path of least resistance rather than standing up for what was right. I told him about the loneliness, about feeling invisible and disposable, about the slow erosion of my self-worth that had taken years to rebuild. We both cried, standing in that little community room surrounded by my paintings and the evidence of my transformation. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. "I'm working on it," I said honestly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean going back to the way things were. It means moving forward with honesty about what happened." He nodded, understanding that earning my trust again would take time and consistent action, not just words. The kids were harder. Emma and Tommy had been thoroughly indoctrinated against me during the months leading up to and following their mother's arrest. They saw me as the grandmother who'd chosen revenge over reconciliation, who'd put their mother in jail rather than work things out quietly. Repairing those relationships would take years, if it was even possible. But I was learning that I couldn't control other people's perceptions of me, only my own actions and choices. I could be available for repair and rebuilding, but I couldn't force forgiveness or understanding. I could love my grandchildren without accepting abuse from them or their parents. The most unexpected gift came from my painting instructor, Marcus. He'd been watching my progress not just as an artist but as a person, and one day after class he made a suggestion that changed my life. "Have you ever thought about teaching?" he asked. "There are so many older adults who think art isn't for them, who believe it's too late to start something new. You could show them that it's never too late to discover who you are." The idea terrified and intrigued me. I'd never seen myself as a teacher, never thought I had anything valuable to offer others. But Marcus was right. I understood the fear of starting over, the doubt that came with trying something new in later life, the courage required to be vulnerable and honest on canvas. I started assisting in his classes, helping other nervous seniors mix their first colors and make their first brush strokes. I shared my own journey, my own failures and breakthroughs, my own discovery that worth wasn't measured by what you gave others, but by what you created for yourself. Within a year, I was teaching my own classes at senior centers throughout Chicago. I specialized in working with people who'd never held a brush, who apologized before they began, who were certain they had no artistic ability. I recognized the self-doubt in their voices because it had been my voice too. "Art isn't about talent," I would tell them, standing before easels filled with eager, frightened faces. "It's about courage. The courage to try, the courage to fail, the courage to try again, the courage to put yourself onto canvas and not apologize for what emerges." My apartment slowly filled with paintings, my own and gifts from students who wanted to share their breakthroughs. The walls that had once displayed photos of a family that didn't value me now showed colorful evidence of creativity, growth, and authentic connection. Mrs. Ramirez and I became closer than sisters, sharing meals and movies and long conversations about the lives we'd lived and the dreams we still harbored. She was learning to knit, I was learning to paint, and we were both learning that reinvention was possible at any age. On my 74th birthday, I threw my own party for the first time in my life. Not a family gathering where I did all the work and hoped others would show up, but a celebration I planned and hosted for people who genuinely wanted to be there. My coffee group, my art students, Marcus, Mrs. Ramirez, and yes, David, who was slowly rebuilding trust through consistent actions rather than empty promises. We gathered in the community room at the Cultural Center, surrounded by paintings and laughter and the kind of warmth that comes from authentic relationships rather than obligatory ones. I blew out candles on a cake I'd bought myself, made a wish for continued growth and healing, and felt genuinely celebrated for the first time in decades. That night, as I cleaned up the remnants of my party, I found a card one of my art students had drawn for me. It showed an old tree with new growth sprouting from its branches, and inside she'd written, "Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to bloom." I taped that card to my bathroom mirror, where I'd see it every morning as I got ready to face another day of possibility rather than obligation. The legal case eventually ended with full restitution paid and Melissa completing her sentence. She wrote me a letter from prison, not an apology, exactly, but an acknowledgement that she'd been wrong, that she'd let her own financial fears and sense of entitlement justify treating me like a resource rather than a person. I wrote back, not to forgive or condemn, but to offer something like closure. I told her about my art classes, about discovering parts of myself I'd never known existed, about learning that worth couldn't be stolen or given away, but only recognized or ignored. When she was released, She made one attempt to reconnect, asking if we could start over. But starting over implied that what had happened could be erased, that we could return to the old dynamic where I gave and she took. I wasn't interested in starting over. I was interested in moving forward, with boundaries, with honesty, with mutual respect, or not at all. 2 years after finding that first fraudulent bill, I finally felt free. Not just free from family obligations and financial manipulation, but free from the need for others' approval to validate my worth. I'd learned that love without respect was just another form of abuse, that family loyalty couldn't excuse criminal behavior, that saying no was often the most loving thing I could do for everyone involved. My life looked completely different than it had before the betrayal. My apartment, once a way station where I waited for family to need me, had become a sanctuary filled with art supplies and finished paintings, books I was reading for pleasure rather than escape, plants that thrived under my careful attention. My days had structure that came from my own choices rather than others' demands. Art classes on Tuesday and Thursday, coffee with friends on Wednesday, teaching at the senior center on Friday, quiet weekends devoted to painting and reading and whatever brought me joy. The money I'd once poured into my family's endless needs was now invested in my own growth and security. I'd opened a small savings account earmarked for travel, something I'd never had the resources or courage to consider, when every spare dollar went to solving someone else's crisis. David and I maintained a careful relationship built on honesty rather than obligation. He visited once a month not because I demanded it or he felt guilty, but because we were slowly rebuilding a connection based on mutual respect. He was in therapy, working through his own tendency to avoid conflict and choose convenience over courage. The grandchildren remained distant, still processing their own trauma from their mother's actions and their family's dissolution. I sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but I didn't chase after their affection or try to buy their love. If they chose to have a relationship with me as adults, it would be based on genuine connection rather than manipulation or guilt. Some people asked if I regretted pursuing the charges, if I thought the destruction of my family relationships was worth the principle of justice. The question always surprised me because it assumed I'd had a real family to destroy, rather than a collection of people who used familial bonds to justify exploitation. I didn't destroy my family, I would explain. I revealed what it actually was. The destruction came from the lies and theft and manipulation, not from my refusal to accept them silently. On quiet evenings, I sometimes looked through old photos, not with the aching nostalgia I'd once felt, but with a clearer understanding of what I was actually seeing: the forced smiles, the subtle signs of my own exhaustion, the way I always seemed slightly apart from the group even in family pictures. The dysfunction had always been there. I'd just been too invested in denial to see it clearly. Now I understood that the woman in those photos, tired, eager to please, perpetually anxious about whether she was doing enough, had been slowly disappearing under the weight of others' expectations. Finding that fraudulent bill hadn't just revealed theft. It had saved my life by forcing me to choose between continued victimization and the scary freedom of self-respect. The scariest part hadn't been losing my family. The scariest part had been discovering who I was when I wasn't defined by what I could provide for others. Learning to enjoy my own company, to trust my own judgment, to value my own wisdom. These were skills I'd never developed because I'd been too busy servicing everyone else's needs. But the reward was greater than the fear. I'd found myself at 74, discovered talents I'd never explored, formed friendships based on genuine affection rather than utility. I'd learned that it was never too late to bloom, never too late to set boundaries, never too late to choose yourself. My art teacher Marcus often said that the best artists were those who'd lived full lives, who had deep wells of experience to draw from, who weren't afraid to put pain and joy onto canvas with equal honesty. I'd become one of those artists, not because I was naturally gifted, but because I'd finally found the courage to be authentic. The paintings I created now were different from those early attempts. They showed the Chicago skyline at sunset, all gold and orange hope rising from industrial gray foundations. They showed hands, wrinkled and spotted but strong, creating beauty from simple materials. They showed women of a certain age laughing together, proving that friendship after 70 was not only possible, but precious. I painted Mrs. Ramirez teaching me to make tamales, her patient hands guiding mine as we worked corn masa into something nourishing and delicious. I painted my coffee group debating politics and sharing grandchildren's stories, each face lined with experience but bright with continued engagement with life. Most importantly, I painted myself. Not as the long-suffering mother and grandmother I'd been, but as an artist with paint-stained fingers and clear eyes, someone who'd survived betrayal and emerged not bitter, but wise, not broken, but beautifully mended. The Chicago Tribune did a feature story about my art classes for seniors, titled "It's Never Too Late to Bloom." They interviewed several of my students, people who'd discovered their own creative voices after decades of believing they had nothing artistic to offer. The article mentioned my background, the family betrayal that had led to my transformation, but focused primarily on the positive outcomes, the community I'd built, the lives I was touching, the proof that reinvention was possible at any age. David brought the newspaper to our monthly visit, pride evident in his voice as he read excerpts aloud. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said, and I knew he meant it. Not proud of me for forgiving and forgetting, not proud of me for making our family drama go away, but proud of me for surviving and thriving despite everything that had happened. That was the moment I knew our relationship might actually be repairable. Not because he was apologizing again, apologies were easy, but because he was celebrating my independence rather than trying to undermine it. On the 3rd anniversary of finding that fraudulent medical bill, I decided to paint the story. Not literally, I wasn't interested in depicting the specific events, but emotionally. I wanted to capture the entire journey from betrayal to liberation in a single piece. The canvas was larger than any I'd attempted before, and I worked on it for months. The left side showed storm clouds and jagged lightning, dark colors swirling in chaotic patterns that suggested confusion and pain. The right side was all golden sunrise, warm colors flowing upward like hope made visible. In the center, where storm met sunshine, I painted a single figure, a woman standing at the intersection of darkness and light, her face turned toward the warmth, but her feet planted firmly in reality. She wasn't fleeing the storm or pretending it hadn't happened. She was acknowledging both the pain of her past and the possibility of her future. When I finished the painting, I knew it was my masterpiece. Not because it was technically perfect. My brushwork still trembled sometimes. My color mixing wasn't always precise, but because it was completely honest. It told the story of a woman who'd discovered that her worst betrayal could become her greatest liberation. I titled it After the Storm, and it became the centerpiece of my first solo exhibition at a small gallery in Lincoln Park. The opening was attended by my coffee group, my art students, Marcus, Mrs. Ramirez, David, and surprisingly, Detective Martinez, who'd become something of a friend after working on my case. As I stood in front of my painting that night, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced before. I'd survived the worst thing I could imagine, the complete betrayal of family trust, and discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever known. An elderly woman approached me during the reception, studying After the Storm with intense interest. "This speaks to me," she said quietly. "I feel like I'm standing in that storm right now." I spent 20 minutes talking with her about her own situation, an adult son who'd been systematically draining her savings, a daughter-in-law who'd isolated her from friends, grandchildren who'd been taught to see her as a burden. It was my story with different characters, the same patterns of exploitation and manipulation that destroyed families from the inside. "What did you do?" she asked, echoing the question I'd once asked Mrs. Ramirez. "I stopped making it easy for them to treat me badly," I said. "I stopped pretending that love meant accepting abuse. I stopped buying their affection with my self-respect." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and I recognized the fear I'd once felt, the terror of choosing dignity over family acceptance, the uncertainty of life without people who'd defined your worth by their willingness to need you. "It's never too late," I told her, pressing my business card into her hand. "You can start over at any age. You can bloom whenever you choose to plant new seeds." That conversation reminded me why my story mattered, why sharing it was important even when it felt uncomfortable or self-indulgent. Elder abuse often happened in silence, hidden behind family privacy and victims' shame. By speaking openly about what had happened to me, I was giving others permission to recognize their own situations and take action. I started speaking at senior centers and community groups, sharing my experience not as a victim seeking pity, but as a survivor offering hope. I talked about the warning signs I'd ignored, the manipulation tactics that had kept me trapped, the moment I decided to choose self-respect over family approval. The responses were overwhelming. Dozens of elderly people approached me after these talks, sharing their own stories of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and systematic isolation by family members. Many had never told anyone what they were experiencing, afraid they wouldn't be believed, or that speaking up would cost them access to grandchildren they rarely saw anyway. I became an informal advocate, connecting these isolated seniors with legal resources, support groups, and counseling services. Mrs. Ramirez and I started a monthly support group for elderly people dealing with family abuse, creating a safe space where they could share their experiences without judgment. The group grew quickly, attracting members from across Chicago. We met in the community room at the Cultural Center, surrounded by rotating displays of our art, paintings, pottery, photography, crafts. Creativity became both our therapy and our resistance, proof that we were still vital, still growing, still capable of producing beauty, despite the ugly things that had been done to us. Detective Martinez sometimes spoke to our group about the legal aspects of elder abuse, helping members understand their rights and options. Sarah Chen, the legal aid lawyer who'd helped me, became our regular legal consultant, providing advice and referrals. Marcus started offering art therapy sessions, teaching us to express trauma and healing through color and form. We became a chosen family of sorts. People who'd been rejected or exploited by their biological families, but had found acceptance and support with each other. We celebrated birthdays and holidays together, cared for each other during illnesses, and mourned together when members passed away from natural causes. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd found my truest family after being expelled from my original one. These people valued my wisdom, celebrated my accomplishments, and respected my boundaries. They didn't love me for what I could give them financially, but for who I was as a person, complicated, wounded, resilient, and still growing. 5 years after finding that fraudulent bill, I celebrated my 78th birthday surrounded by this chosen family. The party was held at the gallery where I'd had my first exhibition, now displaying works by several members of our support group. We'd all discovered that creativity bloomed beautifully in the soil of survival, that art could transform pain into something meaningful and beautiful. David was there, along with Emma, who was now 21 and beginning to understand the complexities of family loyalty versus enabling abuse. She'd started asking questions about what had really happened, doing her own research into elder abuse and financial exploitation. Our relationship was still fragile, still careful, but it was based on honesty rather than obligation. Tommy remained distant, still angry about his mother's imprisonment and the family's dissolution. I accepted that some bridges might never be rebuilt, that some relationships were casualties of necessary truth-telling. I could love him without requiring his understanding or forgiveness. Melissa had been out of prison for 2 years, remarried to a man who didn't know our family history, living in a different state with a carefully constructed new identity. David received sporadic messages from her, requests for information about the children, attempts to rewrite history and minimize her role in our family's destruction. He no longer engaged with these overtures, having learned in therapy that some people were incapable of genuine accountability. During my birthday celebration, Marcus presented me with a surprise, a scholarship fund he'd created in my name for elderly people who wanted to explore art, but couldn't afford classes or supplies. Local donors had contributed $5,000 to get the fund started, inspired by articles about my work in the community. "You've shown so many people that it's never too late to discover who you are," he said in his presentation speech. "This fund will help others follow the path you've opened." Standing in front of that room full of friends and supporters, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude, not just for their gifts and recognition, but for the journey that had brought me to this moment. The betrayal that had once felt like the end of my world had actually been the beginning of my real life. As I looked around at faces that had become dear to me, at art that told stories of survival and transformation, at a community built on mutual respect rather than manipulation, I understood something profound about resilience. We don't survive trauma by pretending it didn't happen, or by minimizing its impact. We survive by integrating the experience into a larger narrative of growth, meaning, and purpose. My story wasn't about a perfect ending where everyone reconciled and lessons were learned all around. It was about the messier, more realistic process of choosing yourself when others refuse to value you, of building new connections when old ones prove toxic, of discovering that you're never too old to start over if you're brave enough to try. That night, after the party ended and the gifts were opened and the last friend had gone home, I sat in my apartment, no longer cramped and depressing but comfortable and filled with evidence of a life well lived. I looked at my paintings covering the walls, at the thank you cards from students, at the photos of my chosen family laughing together. I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years earlier, frightened, confused, willing to accept any treatment rather than risk being alone. She seemed like a different person now, someone I felt compassion for but no longer recognized as myself. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been complete. I opened my laptop and began writing an email to the woman who'd approached me at my first exhibition, the one who'd seen herself in my storm painting. She'd joined our support group, left her abusive living situation, and started taking art classes at 79 years old. Her first painting had been titled Freedom, and she'd given me a print to hang in my kitchen. Thank you for showing me that choice was possible, I wrote. Thank you for proving that it's never too late to bloom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose growth over stagnation, authenticity over approval. There would be art classes to teach, friends to support, paintings to create, and a life to live on my own terms. But tonight, I simply sat in the peaceful quiet of my own space, surrounded by evidence of a journey from victimhood to empowerment, from isolation to community, from performing love to experiencing it authentically. The L train rumbled past my window, carrying other people toward their own destinations, their own transformations, their own hard-won freedoms. I raised a glass of wine to my reflection in the dark window, toasting the woman who'd found the courage to say no to abuse and yes to herself. Here's to blooming whenever we choose to plant new seeds, I said aloud and meant every word. The hardest lesson I'd learned was that some relationships couldn't be saved, that love couldn't fix everything, that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was walk away. But the most beautiful lesson was that it was never too late to discover who you were when you stopped being who everyone else needed you to be. At 78, I was finally living my own life, not as someone's mother or grandmother or victim, but as an individual woman with her own dreams, talents, friendships, and future. The woman who'd once been willing to disappear to keep peace had learned to take up space, to speak up, to shine. And every day, in small ways and large ones, I was still blooming. Have you ever found yourself questioning whether the treatment you're receiving from family is actually love or something else entirely? Have you ever discovered that standing up for yourself meant losing relationships you thought were precious, only to find something even more valuable in return? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone in these struggles, that others have walked similar paths and found their way to the other side. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these difficult but important conversations. And remember, it's never too late to choose yourself, never too late to demand respect, never too late to discover that you're worth so much more than you ever imagined. Thank you for listening to my story. May you find the courage to write your own ending, whatever that may look like.